Welcome to the Bookman's Corner. I'm your host, Lois Lindstrom. Today's book is all about Virginia wine, and the title of the book we'll discuss today is Beyond Jefferson's Vines, The Evolution of Quality Wine in Virginia by author Richard Leahy. Great that you're here, Richard.
Thank you, Lois. It's great to be here.
It's wonderful. Your book is the complete story of wine in Virginia, from the Jamestown Settlement to Thomas Jefferson in his vineyard at Monticello to the thriving wine scene and wine class industry we have today. It has been re-released and re-revised in 2020 with an updated foreword from renowned British wine critic Stephen Spurrier. Author Richard Leahy has once again gifted Virginia wine lovers with a highly readable tour of Virginia's wine industry. Since his second edition was published in 2015, 100 new wineries have joined the industry, and notes on only those wineries who won silver or gold medals in the recent Governor's Cup competitions. Richard, loved your book, and I love the way you've written it and described all these great new wineries. I think our readers should know that you are a real wine expert because you wrote wine columns for local newspapers in Virginia and was the East Coast editor for 11 years of the publication Vineyard and Winery Management. Now, what's new in your third edition of Beyond Jefferson's Vines?
Well, there's a few things. The cover has a photo of the new vineyard of Anketa Ridge, and they're down in Amherst County, and they have caused a stir in the industry because they're making world-class Pinot Noir in Virginia, which nobody thought was possible, including me. So that's an example of some new wineries that are also doing exceptional things. Early Mountain Vineyards and Stone Tower in Loudon are another two wineries that were fairly new in 2015 with the second edition, but are now, doing important things for the industry as a whole. And of course, there's 70 more wineries that have opened in the state. And I have a separate chapter on the four, what I think are the leading wineries in the state. Barboursville Vineyards and Linden, RDV Vineyards, and Anketa Ridge, and it's called A View from the Summit.
Okay, we want to get to all these because there's so much. This book covers so much about the wine industry in Virginia. But tell us about the wine expert Stephen Spurrier from the UK, who wrote the foreword to your third edition of Beyond Jefferson's Vines. He has an eloquent endorsement of the quality of Virginia wine in your book.
Thank you. Yes, and I judged with him at the Virginia Governor's Cup and got to know him. And in 2012, he said at an industry meeting that his favorite North American wine region today is Virginia because it made the kinds of wines he wanted to have a second glass of. Ooh. And this is the man who put California wine on the map back in 1976. So he was happy to promote the industry and to be a judge and so forth, and we got to know one another, and I invited him to write the foreword to this edition, which he kindly did. Unfortunately, just after it was published, he passed away.
And this was during that pandemic period, right? Yes,
that's right.
2020, yes.
Yeah.
Well, it's great that you got his endorsement. And now you said you've been a judge for the annual Virginia Wine Governor's Cup competitions for about 20 years. And what trends have you seen in recent years in this event?
Sure. So we have, on the white wine side, there's been a growth in the professionalism of sparkling wine. And well, I guess Trump Wineries is a good example.
Yes.
But there are many others like Veritas and the Thibaut Jamestown brand that are really making world-class sparkling wine here. And that was something that really hadn't been done before. But at the same time, Viognier is the state white grape, but Chardonnay is by far the most produced white wine. But just in the last year or so, we've changed from a white wine dominated production to a red wine dominated production by 5%. So our red wines
are coming along, right?
Yes. And the quality is being led by what we call the Meritage style blends. And that's a name that refers to red Bordeaux blends. But so I think that the biggest change is the quality of that category. It used to be that people would save the best red grapes for varietal releases, but now they're putting them in the Meritage style blends.
That's excellent. And now, is there a guarantee that the grapes used for Virginia wine are actually from Virginia? I mean, how do you know if a Virginia winery is using out-of-state grapes?
That's a great question. It can be hard to tell. So some of the largest producers are actually getting out-of-state grapes, and this is because there's a shortage of grapes in the state. More people are buying or building wineries than planting vineyards. The good news is that we have grown now, we have 5,000 acres of wine grapes in the state, but that's still not enough to satisfy demand.
So it's a blend then, a blend of the Virginia grapes and other grapes. Is that what you're saying?
There's a provision in the wine laws that says if you put something on the label that says for sale in Virginia only, it can be from out-of-state grapes.
Oh dear.
How crazy is that?
Yeah.
But there's a winery doing that. So
maybe they need to change the law here, right?
well, most of the wine, will say Virginia wine on it, and then it has to be a Virginia product. But there are,
people are getting around that.
Around that, yeah. So I would say that the majority of the wineries are small wineries, 10,000 or fewer cases, and they're selling them locally or in some grocery stores, and people can go and find them, and talk to them, about where they get the grapes and so forth.
That's right.
And part of the Virginia farm winery law, you have to have a certain number of acres, a certain percentage of your production has to be vineyards that you either own or control.
Okay, that's good. Now, what is the current price range for a bottle of Virginia wine?
I would say for a regular non-reserve type of thing, it's going to be around $20, maybe $1.
That's pretty high, though, don't you think?
A lot of people would say that's pretty high. Keep in mind that we're only producing wine in this from Virginia grapes that it's at the top 10% of the pyramid of wine quality. So in larger areas like California, the West Coast,
yes,
they have thousands of acres of grapes,
right,
and then they can make various tiers. But where you can get wine for around $10,
exactly,
or even less. But here in Virginia, we don't have that many acres, and it's expensive to produce wine here because we have to use fungicides, and there are years where we lose crop due to spring frost and this kind of thing. So everyone's really trying to do in the top tier of the pyramid.
Okay.
But the good news is that what you pay for in Virginia wine will stand up against anything else in the price category.
Very good, very good. Well, didn't many Virginia wineries start out with a gentleman farmer who planted grapes and wanted a winery? I mean, how has the Virginia wine industry grown more professionally in the last 10 years? Great
question. And I would say the people who are getting into the industry do a lot more homework than the people who just want to be gentleman farmers.
That's good.
Yeah, and so they also know they have to bring a lot of money into the equation.
And they have to hire consultants, probably. Right?
Yeah, you really can't, even if like I wanted to do this, I would still want to hire like a soil analyst and a viticulturist and so forth, because so much of it comes down to your particular site, both in what's above the ground and what's below the ground.
Sure.
And then are you located on a road that people can see where you are? And there are many, many factors going into it. And it takes between 9 and 10 years to break even on an investment for a small, farm winery.
That's a lot. That's a lot. Now, so that was my next question. What are the challenges to growing grapes in Virginia climate-wise?
Great question. So the reason it's called Beyond Jefferson's Vines, it goes back to 1619 when the Virginia Assembly mandated that male householders plant at least 10 European grapevines apiece. But the European grapevine is a non-native plant.
Yes.
And it evolved in the Caucasus, so in a Mediterranean climate. So it is not adapted to a high humid environment that we have here in Virginia, where we have a lot of fungal diseases. So that's a big problem.
And the problem is it rains right when the harvest comes, right? Right.
So the later in the season it gets, the thinner the skins get, and then when you have rain, then rot can break out.
Very tough.
Yeah, and you also, don't want to put on chemicals that you would want to avoid,
sure,
if you could. So we have the same problems today that Jefferson had. He planted these vineyards at Monticello, but he never got a crop.
He never got a crop?
Right.
Not once.
He was out of town for many years, being ambassador to France and being in Washington.
Right.
But he had the same problems with deer and other animals going after the
grape,
vines, and birds, and also the fungal diseases, and of course the phylloxera vine louse. So he wasn't able to understand what all was going on.
Right.
But fortunately, a few years after he passed away, or right about the time he passed away, Dr. Norton in Richmond had this hybrid that occurred in his garden where he was, doing experiments, and that became Dr. Norton's Virginia Seedling.
Okay, so there you go. Now, how does Virginia wine compare to wine produced in New York, Maryland, and North Carolina?
So, good question. We're all on the East Coast, and aside from New York, we're all in the Mid-Atlantic.
Yes.
So we can do well with the red Bordeaux varieties, and also with Chardonnay. Viognier has been called the Virginia white state grape, but it's got its own peculiar problems as a vine. But we are now making, we have discovered that Petit Verdot, which is another red Bordeaux grape, does very well here. And there's another French grape called the Petit Manseng, which viticulturist Tony Wolfe suggested that we plant. And it is like a Riesling in that it's very fruity, but it's also very high in acidity. The reason he recommended it is that it has a thick skin, so it's resistant to fungal diseases. So it gives growers an edge in getting through the season with undamaged fruit.
Well, so Virginia probably has a tastier wine than these other states. Is that what you're saying?
Well, not necessarily. I'd say that, but we're kind of in the sweet spot for being able to ripen grape varieties and avoid, say, the hurricanes that they would get further south. And also have
the frost they would get. I mean, the snow and the frost, and they
if further north, there are issues with that. Unfortunately, due to climate change, we're having more frost issues in the spring, which we didn't used to have.
Okay.
So it's kind of tough.
It's a tough business. That's right. Well, as you mentioned, you're from Charlottesville, and that is the home of the Trump Winery. What do you think about Donald Trump's wine?
So his longtime winemaker, Jonathan Wheeler, is a very good, talented winemaker, and it was a good idea to keep him on as the winemaker when it changed from Kluge Vineyards to Trump Vineyards. And interestingly, Donald Trump himself doesn't own the winery, it's his son.
Eric?
Yes, he owns the winery, and his father owns the land.
Okay.
He originally had plans for a golf course and so forth. But as I say in my book, what their hallmark are top-notch sparkling wines.
Okay.
So they do a regular, a pink, a rosé, and then they do a reserve white, which is a blend of Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, and they age it for 5 years, and I think it's about $50 a bottle, and it drinks like it too. It's excellent.
So it's like champagne quality, right?
It really is.
Well, that's really cool. Now, let's look at one of my favorite wines, rosé. Which wineries in Virginia produce the best rosé, you think?
Good question. So, rosé is fun because there are a lot of different choices that you can make here. And one of the things I like is that some wineries make the very pale Provençal style, and that's fine. And I think the most popular in that is probably the Crozet Rose.
Crozet Rose.
So that's from King family, and they call it Crozet. It's kind of a pun because they're near the town of Crozet, spelled with a Z, but they spell it with a, like the C in front of the word rosé.
Right, which is very near Charlottesville.
Yes.
Crozet, yeah.
And it's dry. It's got a little bit of, it's even got a Sauvignon Blanc kind of fruitiness to it, and they've put it in cans now. So
so what's the price range, you think? Is it probably still
it's
20-ish, 18?
I think I think it's right around 20. Yeah,
Right
but
around
with the cans, I can't remember how that comes out. But one that I like in particular is from the Chisholm Vineyards, and that's a blend of Cabernet Sauvignon, I think, and Chambourcin. And Chambourcin's a French hybrid, and it makes wonderful, very fruity, cherry-like rosé.
Oh, wonderful. Now, I found it interesting to read that Horton Winery has port. Is port coming into the scene in Virginia, and do you think more wineries will produce port?
Good question. So what I've seen, looking at the industry largely, and this would include New York State, it seems to be that port's becoming a trend. People are more interested in sweeter wines, and the Horton vineyards have made port for quite a while, and they actually use the original Portuguese varieties, which I don't think anyone else does on the East Coast.
Ooh, that's
They're
great.
also making a white port now out of the Petit Montsang grape. But I think King Family is another winery near Charlottesville, and they're making a Petit Verdot port, and that's called Seven, and it's very popular. And now that's not inexpensive, you know.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
But I'd say that port is growing in popularity.
Interesting. Now tell us about destination wineries in Virginia, because some are now used frequently for weddings, I read. Now, tell us about Keswick Vineyard and their neighbors complaining about the traffic.
Well, yes, I had, so Keswick's a very tony place to live. It's east of Charlottesville on an old colonial road, 234 there. And Bruce Schornberg, the owner, told me that, you know, they had weddings there, and one of his neighbors seemed to be shocked that the public was allowed off the main road to like come onto people's property to conduct business. Now, fortunately, this affects other wineries too. There's the Freedom to Farm Act, which is an act of Congress, and there were wineries who people were trying to get them to stop having events or stop, you know, whatever, and they said, look, there's this Freedom to Farm Act, and it's actually been a debate in the industry about, well, are you farming or are you just an event venue?
Yes.
And so that's still playing out in certain areas.
But so many are doing both, right? They're
that's right.
That's right.
Some people, you know, some leading wineries, I won't mention names, have said that they don't do events, and they don't think other wineries should do events either, because they should be putting their energy into
The
farming,
wine, yeah,
into,
farming,
and growing
yeah,
grapes.
Growing
Yeah.
grapes, yeah. Now, tell us about the musician and rocker Dave Matthews wine, which is in Charlottesville. How's that going?
Yeah, that's Blenheim Vineyards.
Okay.
And it takes its name from a historic property there, which is south of town. And he bought the property, and there's a nice house there, and his mother lives there. And then at some point, I think one of his friends from his pre-fame days, you know, talked him into starting a winery. Now, I've never met him, but I like when I go there, it's not all about him. In fact, you don't see his name anywhere.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and it's also a very green building. It's built into the ground, has what they call gravity flow processing, so it minimizes the amount of energy used in moving grape must around. It has great, what they call R value, insulation. It has passive lighting. And his longtime winemaker there, Kirsty Harmon, does a very nice job making wine. He also does the labels for their two best wines. He paints them. And they're called the painted red and the painted white.
How creative is that?
Yeah.
Well, let's return to the evolution of wine in Virginia. I mean, when did the first bottles of wine appear in Virginia, and how did Thomas Jefferson fare when he planted his grapes? I mean, he really we know he didn't do well, but the ones that the first bottles of wine did appear after that decree that all the colonists need to be producing wine, right?
Well, we have no evidence that any wine, let's see, at that time in Jamestown was produced and bottled.
Okay.
But what I found in the second edition was talking to Philip Strother, and he's the proprietor of Philip Carter Winery, and it's called Carter because it references a maternal ancestor. His name was Charles Carter. Now, fun story. So, in 1742, there was a bunch of public-minded Virginia gentlemen put up prize money to encourage others to plant grapevines and make wine in Virginia that they could then send to London. And so Charles Carter won the prize. And it was documented by the Royal Society of Fine Arts in London.
Very good.
So Strother read about this, and then he got in touch with them, and they authenticated it, and he celebrated it like the 250th anniversary back in 2002 or 12. Yeah.
Yeah.
And but they say he had both red and white grapes that he planted, and that people from London came over, and it was documented, and they tasted and proclaimed it excellent quality and sent some bottles
Wonderful.
off to London.
Isn't that cool? Now, what are the best regions of the state to produce wine, and what areas should be avoided as they are not good wine producing areas in our state?
So it always, in the end, comes down to your particular site. You've got what they call the mesoclimate, the larger area, and then it comes down to your actual site. So generally, and this goes back to the revival of the industry in the 70s and beyond, the Piedmont area east of the Blue Ridge has been favored because it has well-drained both air and water.
And it's rather hilly, too.
Yes, it's hilly, which is good for both air and water drainage, which vines like.
Yes.
And in the Northern Virginia area, they tend to produce good whites and elegant reds. In the Charlottesville area, what they call the Monticello appellation, it's warmer there, and with the clay soils, that really favors the Cabernet Franc and the Merlot grapes, and also Petit Verdot. So rich, ripe Virginia reds come from the Monticello area. And in the last 10, 15 years, we have found that the Shenandoah Valley can make very good wines, either red or white.
Oh, wonderful. So probably it should not be too close to the beach then, because the wine, they need to have a mountainous or hilly area. So if you're right by Virginia Beach, that's probably not a good area to grow grapes, right?
It depends. So you have to be aware of the danger of, tropical storms on the beach kind of thing.
Right.
But there are a number of wineries in the Tidewater area that they're set back, from the actual shore.
Okay.
And there's also some nice breezes and so forth, and well-drained soil, so, that can work.
No, interesting. Now, let me ask you, did the pandemic have an effect on the sale or consumption of Virginia wine, do you think?
That's a good question. So a lot of people, had no idea what was going to happen with that. And it was a great test of how the industry had been cultivating their clientele. So what we found was that people wanted to continue patronizing their favorite Virginia wineries and drinking their wine. And the way they were able to do that, even though the wineries were closed, was to buy online and have the wine shipped to them. And there's a winery called Hiddencroft in Loudon, and I myself they had a special, it's like, if you buy 3 bottles, you'll get 20% off or something like that. So I did, and they shipped it to me. And
so the wineries really did rely on shipping wine out during that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, because otherwise they would have gone bankrupt, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just here in Virginia, but I've talked to a vintner in Seneca Lake in New York, and he said 2020 turned out to be one of their best years because people insisted on getting the wine,
That's
and they
right.
did. Yeah.
Very good. Now, if I inherited farmland in Virginia and wanted to start a winery, how many years will it take to get a mature crop of grapes after I plant it?
Okay. So grapevine will give you your first full crop in 3 years. And
That's good. 3 years is not bad.
yeah, although you have to plan on when you order the vines, it'll probably take another year for them to arrive because there's a backlog of demand. You can't just order them on the spot.
Oh, you can't.
Yeah,
Okay,
no.
they're very popular right now.
Yeah,
right?
and the nurseries have to, graft them onto American rootstocks and do all that in advance. So it can take a while before you get your
So you have to
vines
really
delivered.
you really have to be economically stable before you invest in this kind of
Yeah.
endeavor, right? Now, what are your 3 favorite white wines, do you think?
So, it's funny because I used to hate Virginia Chardonnay, and I've never been much of a Chardonnay fan, but that's changed because back in the 80s and 90s, Virginia vintners were making California-style Chardonnay with the sort of rich butter kind of texture and low in acidity. But today, they're using Burgundy as their model. So in
Burgundy.
France, yeah. So you're getting much better acidity, drier, more lively, better with food, And so there are, I'd be happy to drink a Virginia well-made Chardonnay anytime. I also like Viognier because we do it well here, and it's a point of distinction, and it's a well-respected Rhone variety, and it's not easy to do. But we have a sweet spot with the climate that Dennis Horton found.
And isn't that great? Now, Richard, I think it's so fascinating that not only are you writing books, but you are also conducting tours. You have a business in terms of winery tours. Where do you take people on tours?
Okay, so it's called Adventure Wine Tours.
Adventure Wine Tours.
And the URL is adventurewine.tours. And it's only for 6 passengers or fewer, so I specialize in curious and passionate wine lovers who want to learn.
Are the passengers in a van, or are they in a car? I mean, what kind of vehicle? I mean,
usually an SUV.
An SUV.
Yeah.
Okay, so there you go.
Yeah.
And how many do you visit in a day?
So I tell folks that the ideal is to plan on. If they're based in Charlottesville, is to plan on 3. If we're going to the Shenandoah Valley, we might do 2 because of the
distance and travel.
Distance time. Yeah,
that's right. So, well, it looks like our time has come to an end. Where can our viewers find your book to purchase it?
Well, it's on Amazon.
Good.
And there is a link that we have here for people to go, and it will go straight to that listing on Amazon's site. And there are also a few wineries that have copies of it, and from time to time I will do a book signing at a winery. But the easiest way, I think, is to get it at Amazon, and then, sometimes people know I'm doing a book signing, and they'll bring a copy of the book.
Isn't that great? That's great. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being a guest on our show today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate your interest.
Oh, it's wonderful. And thanks so much for watching. Please join us again next month for a new edition of the Bookman's Corner. And have a glass of wine, Virginia wine. I'm Lois Lindstrom.